organizing. So
Better now than later. Sorry.
yeah, for community organizing and engagement. So if there's surveying, communication needs, town different meetings that you're going to have, anything that you need to support the act of engaging and organizing at the community level, so that you have informed residents who are able to vote or weigh in on whatever conversations happening at the local level, particularly around ownership models and pathway forward with a private provider. Um, for the Get Ready program itself, we're just wrapping up contracts with consultants. And they were a little bit delayed just because of some things that we had to go through with the federal funding source. Um, but we're wrapping up those contracts, and given your history with Mission Broadband, that's who is going to be supporting you. And so hopefully in the next week, we can set up a call and bring everyone together along with Tilson Technologies, who will be doing the technical assistance piece. And so we welcome the opportunity to talk to you as a full group, or if you would like to just have Sandy or someone else attend, or whatever mix that looks like, so we can kind of get going on some of those technical pieces and meet you where you currently are in the broadband planning process, with an eye on, the most viable pathway and model, but also the most viable funding source for the communities. So that's a little bit of where Tilson will weigh in. They have been supporting us as an organization on our infrastructure grant funding. So they're a little bit of a common thread throughout our programming, and have access to a lot of the mapping and data that we currently look at when it comes to our infrastructure grant review. So they'll be able to help support on the technical deliverables, but also present some viable models based on where you are as a community, but also based on the funding sources that we have available. And just as a reminder, we are using capital projects funds currently. They're a little bit more flexible because it was a state block grant, so it works within our definitions as a state. And there's another Connect the Ready application window upcoming in the spring, late spring, early summer. And then after that, it'll be BEAD funding, which is a little bit more restrictive from a federal standard, and that comes to us through the NTIA agency. So just wanted to kind of identify those two targets. For some communities, their partnership will need, depending on the ownership model, of course, that kind of makes a difference between how much money you're seeking from the state and also which funding strategy or source might be the most relevant to your community as it stands, especially in the unserved, least served categories.
Okay. Any questions? I had a little question with the grant award, Kendra. The Schoodic Peninsula Broadband Committee comprises membership and represents both Gouldsboro and Winter Harbor, but Gouldsboro has acted as the fiscal agent. I just had a little question about the way the award was worded, that the project was intended for Gouldsboro. Now, is the understanding that it's for both communities, or is it restricted to Gouldsboro?
Because of the partnership, it can be used across both, but I will say, this partnership could have come in for both communities and sought $10,000 for each community, but there was only one letter of authorization and support, and that was from Gouldsboro. So we would have needed to see a letter from Winter Harbor as well. And we had that in some cases, and in others we didn't. So that's why it was just the one $10,000 award in this case. But we recognize that there's a partnership here, and there will be overlap as well as, potentially joint meetings as well. So, as long as it's still used for the right things,
right,
then yes.
I just didn't want to misstep in that case.
Sure.
And we have got Bob.
Muted.
Okay. Any other questions on that part of it?
I just wanted to throw out a question too. So Kendra did mention just someone getting involved in the technical assistance. I wanted to throw it out to the committee members. And maybe Kendra, you might speak more to what is entailed in that technical connection. I'm not sure that I'm the most skilled. I may be the most administrative connected, but there may be others in the committee that would be a good cooperative for this. If you could touch on that a little more.
Yeah, it's, and again, it can be we can work around your meeting calendar, and it can be the full committee or not. But what we're going to be talking about, at least in this first call, is digging a little bit into the data that's readily available and talking through some of your goals. So if there are things you already have decided, so for some communities, they have already decided they want to go down a utility pathway. For others, they've not gotten that far, or they know that they just want to work with a private incumbent and just figure out what how to make their community enticing enough, their project enticing enough to have that incumbent provider prioritize them for the next grant round or a future grant round. So it'll be a lot of those questions around goals, partnership, and in some ways, if we're able to look at joint infrastructure, so we're talking about two communities here, while you are two communities that make sense on a map to work together, we also, it's helpful when we can identify if the infrastructure in place works in your favor or not. So just because two towns are next to each other doesn't mean that's that's how the infrastructure plays out. And some of that is based on old local exchanges that did not follow town lines, and some of it it doesn't go down that pathway. The technical assistance that can be provided is high-level designs, a high-level design, cost pro forma that fill out 20 years to show profit and viability of the project. And that's there are pieces of that change based on that ownership model. And based on, as you get into a publicly owned model, then there's a little bit more that you can play around with, like cost of subscription rates, the amount of profit that's coming back to the community for that debt service, take rate, those kind of things. We also have, you'd be going to RFP and utilizing both Tilson and Mission Broadband to do so. So there's, a number of things that we'll dig into. And for anyone that's interested or just wants to be engaged so that you can track the progress, I would prefer I think the more the merrier when it comes to this, because we're looking for committees that are engaged. But if you kind of have someone tapped, I know this sometimes plays out on committees where there's just someone that has that technical skill set and really interested in it, and they're the person that we would pull in. So I leave it a little up to you on how you'd like to, or if it's one person per community, I leave it a little bit up to you on how you'd like to move forward and work the best with us, and who those point of contacts would be. And it's not the only time that it's definitely not the only time you'd be talking with Mission. They would be supporting you regularly on the community development and engagement side. But with Tilson, it's not the only time you'll talk to them. So they'll take the initial conversation and scope of work and draft those deliverables, and then they would prepare a presentation for you all to weigh in on and engage, and then move forward to something that's more final. And I say all of this while recognizing that there will be ongoing conversations with internet service providers through this program. And at any point, you could say, stop what we're doing because we have identified a partnership. I will fully admit that that's already happened to 3 of the communities in Get Ready, or at least 2, we'll say 2.5 of the communities. One is almost there, but not quite. Between December 1st and January 1st, there were enough conversations and a regional project proposed by an incumbent provider that felt pretty good for their select boards and their goals. And so they've shifted gears pretty rapidly. And so I do just want to acknowledge that that can happen, and that's okay. And it doesn't mean that you're not still supported by MCA in this program. It just means that we shift our strategy in how we're supporting you. And once if that's what we've identified, and of course the goal is to try to get to a viable project and a private-public partnership in whatever way that will make sense. If that happens early on, then we just shift in the a little bit more towards community organizing and communication strategy, pulling in a consultant on that end, and just preparing for whatever warrant vote or community engagement or community participation is needed in the grant process, and away from those more technical deliverables, because that ISP would be responsible for those leading into a grant round. So just wanted to flag that because it's an example that's happening.
Super, that was very helpful, and hopefully community and committee members have a better understanding of how they can get engaged. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And I'm always available. And Thomas Noonan is here. He's one of our regional broadband, well, he representing EMDC is one of our regional broadband partners in the area. You also have the Allen Institute. And so there's lots of resources and supports in the space for you. And I think we just want to be as responsive as we can. We recognize that this program is a little disruption in the space, going from direct grant funding for scopes of work to pulling a little bit more of that in-house and trying to standardize this planning process a little bit more across the state. So I'm definitely open to conversation and feedback. If there's more support that you need or a different level of support that we haven't identified to provide, I'd love to hear it. We have a lot of flexibility around the grant funding for this program. So if there's some technical assistance or other professional services that you have identified that would be helpful, we're happy to look into that and particularly engage from an MCA perspective. We're trying to, through this program, not just support communities and build this infrastructure pipeline, but also start to standardize the planning process and identify the true cost and capacity for communities through planning, because it's been a little all over the place in the last 5 years. And we as a space have changed quite a bit and will continue to around broadband infrastructure deployment and the ways that communities engage. So long story short, I'm always available, and I really welcome your feedback and the partnership between you all and the Maine Connectivity Authority through this.
Thank you, Kendra. And just for reference, we did receive 2 responses to our RFI. We received from Consolidated and from Axiom, and nothing from Spectrum or Charter. So we have those responses, and we're going to look over those, I hope people have had a chance to look over them. I don't want to look over the entire thing right here in the meeting because it was a little bit long and a little bit dense, but just get people's thoughts. But I know last time we had talked about high-level network design being on the horizon for one of the next steps. After we review these, what would, I defer to you and Thomas, what would you say would be our next route we should go?
So you had an RFI, not an RFP, right?
Correct. We're just trying to gauge who would be interested in having discussions at this point.
Yeah. Well, and I just, based on the 2 that you just said, I expect that those responses are very different from each other, knowing the operating models that are at play in both structures, as well as incumbent versus a non-incumbent provider.
I was actually surprised at the similarity, but go ahead, Bob.
Oh,
yeah, no, they're both boilerplate on that there. So there's nothing outstanding. Would be the typical response from both providers on that. What Consolidated did was give a list of addresses, because they're a local exchange carrier, so they have telephone, they're the LEC. So, but as far as the nuts and bolts on Axiom response, there seemed to be and Roy, correct me if I'm wrong, but there seems to be a large difference in price and performance. And the gotcha was if there's a catastrophic outage, the towns would be on the hook for like a $1,500 charge for that. So, I mean,
Yeah.
depends.
The
Yeah, I mean,
deductible was 50, somewhere in that range,
Hmm.
yes.
yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that's a concern because hey, towns are strapped for cash. So
Sure.
that might be a negotiable item.
Yeah, I actually don't remember seeing much in the way of individual plan. Maybe I just glossed over individual plan pricing from Axiom. I did see that Consolidated did say their plan rates would be the same as their standard Fidium plan
Mhm.
rates. They mentioned a user fee that would be assessed to recover costs if it was a bond funded
Hmm.
project. So whatever the principal plus interest divvied up amongst their customers. So I would assume that might be in addition to the regular plan fee. Just seeing how my own Consolidated Communications bill looks.
Mm,
There's the plan, and then there's all the additional fees. So that was a question I had about that.
right.
So can I take a step back? Are the ownership models under these two responses the same? Or, because I know that Consolidated has, that Axiom is typically a publicly owned ISP, right? Is open to operating on someone else's infrastructure, whereas Consolidated is not. However, I know that Consolidated has deployed, not so much in Maine, but elsewhere, a model of in 20 years time, it becomes a publicly owned infrastructure. And they do a cost share through that 20 years, and you're eventually owning that structure. I know it's something they proposed on Long Island, and it just didn't work out that way, but it's something that they have modeled elsewhere in New Hampshire, I believe. And so is that what they proposed here, where you all own the middle mile, they own the drops, or is it a fully privately owned standard Fidium model?
But we'd have to look closely at that, to be
I
honest with you, Kendra.
do
Okay.
believe, let me just skim down through it here. I believe they definitely did talk about different funding models, but I believe there was let me find my notes because that's probably going to be more useful.
And to just quickly to answer Sandy's question, there's a I know Mission Broadband has a scoring mechanism, but that's typically based on their own RFP design. There is a scoring mechanism that the Island Institute has created for RFPs, and I'm sure it could be adapted to an RFI. The struggle sometimes is when you're comparing an apples to oranges proposal. So when you're preparing, or when you're considering a publicly owned model versus a privately owned model, an incumbent versus a non-incumbent, because sometimes it comes down to cost, and you're looking at typically a very large difference in cost in the upfront capital. And so how it comes back to community's goals and value set of how you want to balance that upfront capital cost difference with affordable tier rates, the ability to own and create and generate revenue, the ability to control those tier rate prices and have some kind of price freeze for 10 years, 20 years, whatever that looks like. So there's a balance there with the recognition that while the upfront capital costs on a privately owned may be less, the long-term cost of a public model sometimes wins out, but it takes being able to project that private model out. So you're starting to look at them in the same timeline and structure and see where those benefits fall long-term. So there is a little, thanks, Thomas. There is a little work there to make proposals. And again, I'm assuming your responses, they could easily be both public models, just a different approach to that public model. But there is a little bit of work there to create a level playing field for scoring.
Going back to my notes, I do see here that the consolidated proposal says that if the network is to be community-owned fiber, then they, as part of their proposal, would need a 20-year exclusive right to use it. And I presume that means exclusively them. But that at least does tell me that they're open to it being the community's fiber in the long run. But 20 years is pretty far out there too.
Yeah, so to put that in perspective from those two models that I know, Axiom has off ramps, I think, every 4 years. So you can assess performance, and if it's not working out, you can go back out to bid, and they can compete again against someone, with the understanding that this would probably be a one ISP network. It wouldn't be open in the sense that multiple ISPs would be competing on your network. There's just really not the competition and density in the state for that model, at least from what we've seen. On the consolidated side, they would be the only provider you could have on that network for 20 years. They also own the drops. So the question becomes at the 20-year mark, right? They own the connections to the house where you own everything else for those 20 years. The question becomes at the 20-year mark, when you have paid back, do you now own the drops and the ability to bring on a new ISP if you want? Or do they continue to own those drops? And if you bring on a new ISP, do they now have to reinstall new drops, which is typically a heavy cost to either the publicly owned model if they take over that cost, or the individual resident if they wanted to switch, right? And that can be anywhere between $150 and several thousand, depending on the length of that drop. So one thing to consider. We haven't seen that model play out in Maine. We had a hope there, but after they got funding, Long Island and Consolidated got funding and redid the design, it wasn't as a substantial contribution from the town. So Consolidated covered it, and the town decided to not go down a publicly owned or 20-year out publicly owned model. And so it's now a fully privately owned model. And we haven't seen it really play out in New Hampshire in the sense that it just hasn't been 20 years yet to know how that all really shakes out in the end. So just some questions to consider in your mind if you're leaning towards a publicly owned model and you want to weigh out which one is potentially scores better. However, Consolidated also does a privately owned infrastructure model more frequently in Maine, and for some communities, that's where they go.
Anybody else on this part of it? We can have more discussion on the details of the responses a bit later.
Absolutely, because it's a 72-page response from Consolidated, and so there is something to be digested, especially in the beginning. Like I said, a lot of it is boilerplate. Now comes like the terms and conditions, which is really requires close scrutiny on that. The Axiom is, it's an 8-pager, and I'm trying to get these things to print. For some reason, they don't want to print. But the Axiom probably requires greater response from them. Roy, I'm open to anything, honestly.
The next thing on the agenda was the RFI responses anyway, so we'll just go right into that. I thought there was certainly more detail in the Consolidated response, even if we take out the list of addresses and the maps, though I really appreciated the maps.
Yeah.
speaking quite selfishly as the IT manager of Schoodic Institute, to see that Schoodic Institute's address listed in that response, that makes me feel really good about not having to run a couple miles of fiber ourselves. But I also saw some things that I would characterize as maybe on the order of red flags about their response, and that was that they mentioned explicitly that they do use splitters for the last mile, and I'm not sure the technology. They say they do a 132 split, and I know that when we talked with Pioneer Broadband, they had said that what their recommendation was to not use splitters in the field, but to do have a solid fiber basically from every cabinet or what have you, or the central office to the premise, so that you're not cannibalizing your potential for bandwidth right off the bat, which makes me worry about the consolidated proposal perhaps not having the long-term capacity. If we start to see more development in these areas, more people moving in, that was a concern, which I think is more of a technical level concern than we probably have the ability to discuss here today. And go ahead.
Roy, all I was going to say was that that central office on Newman Street in Winter Harbor is awfully small. That was their D-SLAM.
Yep.
So I mean,
still is, I'm sure.
Yeah, it is. You're correct. It still is, as well as telephony. So I'm concerned on space.
The other thing is, I noticed they did talk about, I think they said a guarantee of up to 2 gigabit symmetrical, but the symmetrical was frequently left out of discussions as the speeds increase. So just because I'm a detail person and I want to maintain our insistence on symmetrical speeds as we're going along, that tells me they did talk about areas where there was a less than symmetrical service. On the other hand, they talked about subscription rates and when they would look at upgrading service based on the saturation of their network. So, but that just, I guess where I am with the consolidated project is, I feel like this is just from my reading of it. If we decide that for whatever reason, a community-owned project is going to be impractical, that consolidated is a good fallback option, but I wouldn't want to own that network. I would rather them own the network if we're going to go with consolidated. That's sort of my take on their proposal, just from what I've seen. That's very, and the consolidated building in Winter Harbor may be in the flood zone from Sandy.
Matter of fact, I have flood maps I can provide on that, and there's a good possibility. There's a very good possibility. So,
let's see. Anybody have any? I mean, I have some other notes, but I don't want to dominate the discussion. Anybody? Why don't we talk about the consolidated one first, and then we can move on to Axiom.
Well, I think with the consolidated, I think we take like the first, 15 pages and go through them with a fine-tooth comb and look at any red flags or gotchas that there may be. So yeah, the first 14 pages is on the consolidated one that really needs close scrutiny on that. And then towards the end is their pricing. But you're right, 1 gig, 2 gig, 250 meg, 50 meg, things like that. We can go through that. So I think maybe the 16, 17 pages or so.
You want to look at that right now? I can,
Well, we can look at the pricings and at the end.
okay, let me see about bringing that up on screen.
I mean, basically, they're giving you the 50 meg essential, which does not cover the specs. And then if you want to have voice on there, there's an additional charge for that, which is pretty much a standard offering.
So you
Uh,
want to go to the end first, look at the pricing?
Yeah, let's look at the pricing. If really quick. I mean, the network design and everything. There's several schools of thought on it.
Well, because visual is good, let's look at the map real quick too.
Sure. Yeah.
Because that's, I mean, I was actually pleased to see the map.
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of, I mean, this is for later on anyway, but there's a lot of yellow here that actually doesn't need to be even included over on campus because there's nothing there. It's
Well,
park service.
have you talked to the bears and the deer?
You know, they don't pay taxes, they don't get a vote.
Okay.
They can borrow somebody else's Netflix password. But, and I think up here actually is even, I'm not sure if that's in that new preserve area or not, but I mean, there's some questions. This is the campground over here. So, but I was pleased to see, I assume each one of these different colors is to be served by a different, segment of the network. I would assume that's why they have this coded this way. But it does seem to cover all of the areas, like you said, that's an address list from probably all their served locations with telephone.
Correct.
But it definitely covers all of the primary underserved areas that I know of, geographically speaking. So looking at the pricing, residential and business are different. Incidentally, that's different from Downey's, well, from Pioneer Broadband. They just have packages and they don't, like they said, they don't care who uses it. But I'm not sure, that's again more detail what the difference is between the actual services provided for residential versus business. But
Oh, you know what? Did you see a legend anywhere with the colors represented?
I did not see it.
Because I didn't see it either.
I see some some text on here: FDH number 2, FDH number 3, FDH number 4.
Uh-huh.
So I would assume fiber distribution hub or something like that.
It's possible.
Just pulling those letters out of thin air, but that would make sense to me. I assume that's what those correlate to, but no, there's no legend.
Yeah, if they're talking about a split network, then there's only so many fibers they can be going from one area to another. So these are going to be, they're not distinctly separate, but they are going to be different, fiber bases for backhaul. And their pricing is statewide. So where like Spectrum is a national pricing, Consolidated is, I think, as a state by state pricing, or maybe region by region. So they don't negotiate on pricing because it's at a state level. They have entered conversations from time to time around rate freezes, depending on how much a community can put up to offset a rate freeze. But we haven't seen that play out to completion. I know there's at least one community in the state that's been talking to them from that perspective, but they haven't gotten to contracts or build or anything like that. So that's the only real wiggle room. They are an active ACP, if I could remember my acronym, Affordable Connectivity Program. Yeah, thank you. Yep, yes, there it is. So as are all ISPs that currently deploy network in the state or participate in connectivity in the state. So there are some affordability pieces around it, but they set their pricing at a state level, where some main-based providers do negotiate town by town.
There's also an interesting misunderstanding on their behalf, besides the fact that they refer to Winter Harbor several times as Winterport Harbor. They reference free drops per, they reference three free drops for the town. And initially they didn't specify. So my question was, is that one or both towns? But later on they specify for all 5 towns, which tells me they are counting the villages of Gouldsboro as separate towns. So they basically offered 15 free drops total, which I don't know that we would necessarily try to take advantage of that, but it's nice that that's in there up front.
And the free drops, are they specific about the fact that they're town-owned building drops, like a town office, a school, etc., or are they just
They just
free
said
drops
free
for
drops for the
affordability?
town,
Okay.
for the town government,
Interesting.
basically. So, because I know that's something that has been done with Spectrum. It's
Mhm.
previous
Maybe
incarnations.
Bob.
Hello?
Roy, sorry to jump in. Bob, do you know, with the town of Winter Harbor, do you remember the commitment we had in the past? We had 2 drops that were part of our past contract. And there was that question of, it was only municipality buildings, because we were trying to expand it, I thought, to the library or the historic society, but the contract only limited it to the municipality building.
Well, I don't know offhand on that, because
Okay.
you're right, we have not heard from Spectrum. So that's something we do. We need to get them. And FDH is a fiber distribution hub. All right, using using fiber optic and splitters. So
So
it's
yeah,
not, yeah, so I mean, at least I know what that is now.
yeah. So I mean, that, like I said, that was something that, again, assuming, they're proposing to build it that way. They've been in this business for quite a while. I'm sure they know what they're doing, but I'm also sure they're going to save wherever they think they can save too. And it makes me worry about the potential for expandability for this network down the line.
Well, if you look at the definition of FDH, why they're doing that, it makes, I'll read it from here. It's real short. It makes easy and fast service connections and reconfigurations, and serves as a testing point in the outside plant network. So, yeah, things have changed in like 4 years since I've been involved. So,
just trying to find the area where they're talking about the split. They of course include references to other projects they've done. Let's see. This is more of the network specifications here.
Well, this is probably some of the questions we would have for Consolidated.
Yeah.
So
I would certainly say we don't have to go into super detail right now, but any of the questions we have, I think we should throw together in a document and send them back. Just see what else. Zoom controls given away, imagine that.
I'd also ask if I can share.
Absolutely.
Just based on the competitive nature of our state grants right now and the difference in funding between Capital Projects Fund and BEAD funding, I'd also just make a priority to ask if they, either Consolidated or Axiom, would be willing to support you all seeking funds under this next Connect the Ready round. While we don't have a date determined for the application window, I mean, we're looking probably within the next 3 to 6 months, kind of late spring, early summer, just based on turnaround time. And both of these ISPs have been through the process in this previous application window. They were both awarded and not awarded. They both submitted applications beyond what they received awards for. But now that they've been through it once and had previously been through it with Connect Main Authority, it would be worth asking if they feel like there's the ability to turn around a proposal within that time frame. And or if they feel like it's too soon, if there's not enough time, and then they're looking out towards BEAD. So it just might be something that you could ask and weigh in your scoring. And I don't know if they build it into this or not. But just something to flag, because we've got a tight timeline on the next Connect the Ready round. We have a bit more time between now and BEAD funding.
Yeah, I did see that both of them said they would do the grant writing and all of the work to attempt to secure the grant. So that was in both proposals that I saw. Let's see here. So one to two, both of them were in the same ballpark, 1 to 2 years completion time for Consolidated, and Axiom, I think, said about in the neighborhood of 14 months once financing is secured. CCI will do the grant writing, and there's the 20 years exclusive rights. I think it was, if in a similar way, I think Axiom wanted a 12-year exclusive use of the network, but again, as you mentioned, they did have those off ramps or whatever you called them. If CCI would pay the user fees and maintain the network during that 20-year period, 3 free connections for the town, and user fees determined based on principal and interest. They talked about the install, and the first 250 feet were free, 2 foot thereafter to the customer if they were doing micro trenching, which I'm not going to say it's great, but and then the $200 one-time install fee if you want this is supposed to be 2 gigabit plan, because I guess there's different hardware required. Customer issues lasting more than 24 hours will result in a credit. There's something, and this, I guess I'll go back to the other view here. The piece that threw me in the Axiom response is that they said it would be prohibitive to add to the network after the first year during the construction. And that was something that I want to ask about with them, because I can certainly envision other people moving in and needing to install new service to new areas. And I'm hoping they're just saying, if it's in an area that's not served when we do the build, that becomes prohibitive. Not that it's impossible to add new service to an existing place where fiber runs by, basically. So that was a concern that I had with their response.
Roy, I'll just add to that, with comprehensive planning going on with both towns right now, that would definitely be a concern, because we're looking at bringing in affordable housing to the peninsula. So there's definitely going to be some building and development in the near future.
Yeah. And I mean, was like the that that Spectrum issue they had in Sullivan, where the system that checks for availability only included those addresses that had previously been served, not addresses that the cable ran by that had never been served. So it's a pretty important distinction. So I don't think it wouldn't make sense to me that if the fiber's on the poles, that it would be impractical or cost prohibitive to add service, especially the way Pioneer had described it to us in the past, which is why I sort of keep going back to that, because their model seems to be the most upgradable and serviceable going forward, which is why I'm leery about the consolidated one. Again, unless we say, you know what, we just don't want to own the network, we let them deal with it, but that's not what we're trying to do for future proofing.
Roy, just out of curiosity, did Consolidated mention their work with other towns in the region or RDOF funding at all?
They
this-
referenced, this is still sharing, right? You're still seeing this?
Yep.
They referenced Long Island, and they referenced Eastbrook, and I think they also referenced Chesterfield, New Hampshire.
Okay.
And I don't know what I didn't take notes on what the funding models or anything of that nature.
Mhm. Okay.
I can send, I don't know that we sent these to you because these just came over the course of the last week, but I can certainly provide these proposals to both of you if that would be useful.
If you don't mind, Roy, I would like to take a look at that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other thoughts? I think you were saying something, Bob, but you were muted there. And you're still muted.
Better? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
All right. Well, I think like the first 10 pages of Consolidated, we really need to go over with a fine tooth comb, get our questions ready. Obviously they've done or attempted to do this before. There's some gotchas that I don't like on that. Number one is their response to failure. That leaves something to be desired, but that's something we can look at too. Yeah. If a tree falls down, if a tree falls down on the fiber, how long and who's going to fix it?
Right. They did describe that.
Well, they had a time of like 25.7 hours after the ticket's been opened on that.
Right.
But we'll see. The other thing too is that on the drops, the first 250 feet is free, and then every additional foot is a cost of $2 to the customer.
Yep.
So that can get pricey.
If I'm remembering correctly, in the Downey's broadband model, it was the first 1,500 feet were included, which is a significant difference, obviously.
Oh, absolutely. So, this is where we need to really sit down and go over this. So which we'll do.
Yep, we'll definitely do that. And now everybody's going to have access to it. And I will set up a Google Doc if that works, that people can just enter their concerns on directly. their questions, and that's sort of what we did before, if that's good with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And then, we'll give it to potentially, do you want to say till the next meeting and then we review them and then send them off? Would that make sense to give everybody time to digest, or if we can always do it sooner? I just
Well,
want
I
to make
think-
sure people have the opportunity to get them in there.
Well, you know what? We can do a collaborative maybe effort on this. Everybody has a different point of view on it. And then put it down, put pen to paper. I mean, that's just a suggestion. That's all.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. I'm going to stop sharing so I can actually use my screen. Let's get back here. I'm sorry. So I don't remember if I heard the response. Is there a particular step that we should be looking at? Obviously, we're going to go over the RFIs in detail and submit questions back to Consolidated and Axiom.
Mhm.
But other than that, as a procedural thing, moving forward, is there a next step that Kendra, you and Thomas think we should be doing? Should we be looking at that community engagement piece? Should we be looking at the high-level network design? What would our next practical step be that you think?
Sure. So on a couple of fronts, one is to determine the next steps for this RFI. And if at some point you're interested in going out to an RFP for a partnership, or if you'd like this to be, if you have the authority and your towns are comfortable with going through the RFI process to engage a partner around, whatever type of model you feel most comfortable with. So the next step around, if you're going to score it, if you're going to have follow-up conversations with each of them, either via email or it sounds like you have questions, or virtually kind of face-to-face. And then what that decision-making structure looks like, or if there is a decision to be made. That kind of tells us what you need on the technical assistance side, because if you're going to make a decision around a partnership, then the technical assistance looks a little bit different. If you're just using this to kind of glean the possibilities that are out there and you want to do the high level design and get a better understanding of your infrastructure and different viable models to then kind of engage from a perspective of, you have a little bit more knowledge behind you, and maybe engage other providers if you're not satisfied with the fact that you only got two. Some communities are happy with that. Some communities want more. So there's a little bit of that and wading through some of the gray there. On the communication side, it's you have a product that from two ISPs, you've gone through a process. It's worth talking about that to your greater communities so they're keeping up with the ways that you're engaging, especially because you did engage an incumbent provider. And I'm going to assume that you have another incumbent provider that's a cable company that didn't respond. Right. So when you're thinking about a future partnership, especially if there's money involved from a public perspective in the capital stack to make it work, the more information, the better, especially when you're talking about decisions around which incumbent or going with a non-incumbent provider, right? People are going to want to know, well, did you talk to everybody that operates here? Well, what did they say? Well, now they're saying they can do something. What did they say 6 months ago when you asked?
Right.
The playing field's a little bit different than it was a year ago in broadband in Maine, right? Sometimes they respond, sometimes they don't, and then they kind of show up at your town meeting or at an information session saying, well, we've changed our mind, we actually can do it. So, the more due diligence that a committee does and the more you communicate out to both your select boards and your community around the progress that you're making is beneficial. So I highly encourage, because you did have a process and the results, I highly encourage some kind of presentation, and that can either be to the select boards or it can be to the full community.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying that not knowing necessarily the dynamics at play in your communities. Some communities are okay with it happening at the select boards because they trust their select boards. And if the process seems to go through, then they just kind of say, yep, they know what they're doing. Others, the full community wants to know and keep up with the process that's happening. So I always err on the side of communicating more, especially not knowing at this moment if there's going to be an ask of your community in a vote type manner in the future. So the more you can get out ahead now, the better. So
I'll
Okay.
just, oh, Thomas, go ahead.
Sure. Well, I was just going to ask Kendra Joe, would it be possible for the Scudic group to have a preliminary discussion with Mission Broadband and Tilson surrounding the technical assistance for municipally owned networks after they're back and forth with these two providers, just so they can understand a little bit of the pathway on the municipal side of things?
yeah, we can absolutely do that. You know, the sooner the better to get you talking with both of those consultants. And it's also up to you. We can share your RFI responses with Mission Broadband Tilson, and they can give you some feedback. You know, at least one of them hasn't been connected to you or monitoring your progress, so they can give you a little bit of feedback on what they're seeing and raise any questions or red flags that they just want to make you aware of, or, you know, good points as well, not just the negative. So I leave that to you. Not every community wants to share out RFI responses, and I don't know what you had in your RFI, if that's even possible around confidentiality, but I do just want to put it out there that I'm happy to request that they review it before that meeting so that we're also bringing in that perspective and everyone's has the same kind of information around who shared what. I will say that at least one of the Tilson consultants that we are working with, just for transparency, used to be employed by Consolidated. So he has in Maine. And so he has a bit of understanding of their network deployment and operating model. But he now works for Tilson. So I do just want to be transparent there that there is that kind of overlap or historical overlap on our side with Tilson.
From my perspective, I don't have a problem sharing that information. To me, the purpose of our RFI was just to engage with the providers and see who would be interested in working with us in the first place. It's in an abstract level. It's not very specific. We said, look, we want to basically cover everybody. We want to be able to have a minimum of 100 by 100 over fiber. And that's sort of where we were, and I can provide that document unless there's objection from the committee. I can send that along with the responses. And I, you know, Tom makes the point, we have a tight time frame, and I think I'm of the opinion that if we can engage more with the communities, it's going to be better. And even though I think probably a good first step then might be for us to figure out what we want to do to meet with the communities and then approach the select boards about making sure, because they, you know, I don't want to step on toes there either. I think we should approach the select board saying, look, we've got these responses. There's a couple different models we can pursue. We would like to engage with the communities and see what the community preferences for those going forward. And so does that seem like a reasonable thing to do? And we can certainly engage with those select boards very quickly. I would think we could put something together into them very soon. And it's just a question of how soon they meet.
We can do that.
Yeah. Thank you. And yeah, feel free to share, and I can move that forward on our end. I will also add that we have contracted with a gentleman named Dan Demerit out of Bangor for communication support. And one of his first tasks will be talking with all of the communities. I think I left this out. Talking with all of the cohort members to build out a communications timeline. So there's more consistency on your end on how and when you're communicating and kind of what mechanism works best for both of your communities. That might be different for each community. It might be the same. Some communities do Facebook, some people show up at every select board meeting. So whichever makes the most sense, or has a local newspaper, but he'll be connected with you to build that out so that there's more of a cadence to your communications, regardless of, so that you're not just waiting for like, we did a thing, now we can talk about it. And maybe you don't do something else for the next 6 months, and maybe you do something 2 weeks later, but there's just a little bit more of a cadence when you're talking to both your select boards and your communities at large. And you'll have a lot of input into that because it's going to be specific to how your communities talk to themselves, but also how they talk to each other. And every community in Maine is a little different in how
Yep.
they communicate. So we want to be respectful and reflective of that. So just flagging that that'll also be a piece that comes up in the next couple of weeks as well.
Okay. Kendra, thank you.
But yes, thank you both for joining us. And I think we've got a couple other items before I forget it again. We have minutes to approve, and I believe everybody's had the opportunity to review them. If you haven't, you're welcome to say so, and we can either bring them up or email them over to you. But we have September 27th, October 25th, and November 29th, for which subsequent meetings there was not a quorum to be able to approve them when they came up on the agenda. So unless there's an objection, they can be approved.
Approve.
I vote in favor, and certainly a majority of those present and voting. So yay, we've approved minutes. We did a thing.
All right.
So just briefly, Gouldsboro, not much to report other than there was a note about our work going into the comprehensive plan. Jim Guest reached out to me, and I did give him a couple sentences to put in there, which just basically describes our work. I haven't heard anything else from Winter Harbor as far as survey results go. So I think it's safe to say that we can consider the Winter Harbor survey closed. We have all the data we're going to get out of that. Rhiannon has received all of those responses, and hopefully she'll be able to, I think probably for next time, I'll ask her to just give us a summary of what we've got. She was not able to join us today, and that brings up a scheduling question because her class schedule for this semester conflicts with this meeting. So I'm not sure if people want to think about adjusting the meeting time for this meeting to another day. Do you want to do that to allow her to participate, or what's the pleasure of the committee in this regard?
Well, I think we should be, go ahead.
Just two things. Town members or town manager and select board member from Winter Harbor were going to attend today, but the 1 o'clock meeting is definitely a challenge. So they requested evening meetings. I'm totally open with something later. And secondly, regarding the survey, but I did share the comp plan survey of broadband with the select board. They did ask to see what the more recent survey results are. So as soon as Rhiannon has those, we want to get those to the select board of Winter Harbor as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, and so evening is preferable for Winter Harbor Town Office. Tuesday nights are most frequently my school board meeting nights, and Wednesday evening I have another commitment as well. So I'm not sure what other people's schedules look like, but maybe we can throw some times out there that people are able to meet. over
Okay.
email, and then we can sort of see what works best.
Sure.
All right. Can we set a time frame for our review and comments of the RFI responses so we can submit documents for the respondents to provide our answers to our comments? That will give us timeline for our next steps. And yeah, so I mean, raise your hand if you haven't had a chance to look at the RFI. Well, that's a good start. Okay, Sandy, you haven't had a chance. So do you think you'll be able to within the next week?
Yeah, I should be able to over the weekend. To be honest with you, it's very technical deep for me. So I'm trusting that those of you that are in the realm have a better understanding of it. But I'll scan it over this weekend and put any comments into the Google document.
Right, and I will share that document before this. Well, I'll try to share it this afternoon or this evening, so we can all start adding our own comments into it and questions. And so if we could ideally by next Tuesday be ready to send this off, we can submit our questions to the contacts at both Consolidated and Axiom, if that works for people.
Yeah.
Okay. We will plan on that. And let's see. Next steps. So we're gonna approach the select boards, figure out public comment things subsequent to that. And okay, so our next meeting is tentatively Tuesday, February 28th at 1:30, unless we select a different time before then.
All righty.
Anybody have anything else?
Nope, I'm good.
Seems good.
Thank you all for attending, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you, Kendra. Thank you, Roy. Thanks,
both.
everybody.
Thank you.
Roy, thanks for
everybody.
having me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.